Welcome to Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety, where we talk about the real issues out on the road, focus on safe driving, and learn industry best practices from your hosts Kenny Ray, Mike Bohan, and Jim Seibert, in the hopes that by driving the line, we get more drivers home safe and sound. This podcast was made possible by Marsh McLennan Agency.
Hello, and welcome back to Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety. I'm Jim Seibert, and along with me today is Mike Bohan, Barry Harrison, and Mr. Kenny Ray. Today we're just going to be talking about some OSHA, favorite topic of most, as I recall, that shop and maintenance bay safety is always number one and top of our priority list. I say that in jest. And we're going to just have an open discussion about things that we might encounter, things that we've seen, things that concern us. And on behalf of Mike here, I'm going to start with Missouri. Crushed under powered industrial truck. Fatally struck by arm of machine. Died and fall through roof. Died and fall from ladder after being shocked by electrical equipment. Fatally crushed under bus. Fatally struck sink in fall in kitchen. Fatally struck by front end loader. Fatally struck by falling tree. Fatally injured by electrical saw. Died and fall through skylight. That's Missouri. How about Texas? Fatally crushed between golf cart and trailer. Died in wildfire. Fatally struck by passing truck. Electrocuted when forklift contacted power lines. Fatally injured in fall in parking lot. Fatally crushed between trench box and guardrail. Fatally struck by falling pipes. Fatally struck by falling door. Died and fall from roof. Died from carbon monoxide exposure while cleaning tank. That's Texas. How about the state of Oklahoma? Electrocuted when ladder contacted power lines. Fatally struck by a rolling truck. Fatally struck by counterweight of pump jack. Died and fall from rail car. Fatally struck when motor fell off of jack. Died and fall from platform. Died and fall from ladder. Fatally burned and release of gasoline. Died and fall from scissor lift. Died in a trench collapse. There's a lot of dieds there, and I don't make light of any of them. But when I look at those top 10 or the latest 10 fatalities for Missouri, Oklahoma, and Texas, and I just picked those states because that's where us four are from and where we reside. I looked at those and I looked at in the maintenance realm, which one of those fall in line on maintenance fatalities? And in preparing for the podcast today, me and the guys, we get together and we just kind of talk through, hey, what hits, what makes an impact, and what is remembered and what's talked about and brought forward. And I got to looking at some of these numbers, and many of these, I ran them through the website on the NACS codes, the number that identifies maintenance shop operations, and many of these are in there. And then I started looking at what are the top 5 most cited things in maintenance shop automotive industry. And number 1, can I get a guess from you guys? What do you think number 1 is most cited for last year maintenance?
I think Sean say HAZCOM.
100% correct. Hazard communication. Yeah. Number 2 is going to be a surprise. It was for me, but respiratory protection. And number 3, it kind of goes back and forth. It's electrical systems and powered industrial trucks. Number 4, powered industrial trucks and lockout tagout. And number 5, for the last 5 years, was a mixture of these 3: personal protective equipment, portable fire extinguishers, and abrasive wheel machinery. Mike, when I come and we're with your trucking customers and we go out there and I do a OSHA audit of their shops, I always call them the low hanging fruit. Those fire extinguishers and those grinder benches, they're the easiest ones and they're always cited. And here they are, top five.
Yeah.
Gents, there's a pattern here between crushed, struck bys, and falls within our industry. And all of them are found within these maintenance shops. And as we look and we listen and we discuss going forward here, let's keep in mind that there's so many similarities from state to state. There's similarities across all the United States. And we've got this data and this information in front of us. And it's been around for a long time. Getting real personal with our listeners. How are we still having these injuries, having these fatalities when the materials are there, the information is there, and the assets like consultants are there? Why is it still happening? And it's easy to find these hazards in the workplace. With that, I open it up.
Jim, I want to remind our listeners of a couple of things, and then I want to respond to what you just said. I want to remind our listeners, first of all, of two things. Number one, ladies and gentlemen, we do not rehearse these episodes. We know what our topic is, but then we just get together and we have a conversation. And we're coming up on year 3 of this podcast. And Jim Seibert, I want to tell you, that may be the most sobering, and this is meant to be complimentary of your planning. That may be the most sobering introduction we've ever had to an episode. I sat here, and I'm down in Texas right now. I sat here with goosebumps on my arms as you were rattling off those incidents that have occurred just in our 3 states where we live. And I was thinking, as you listed each one, I tried to picture in my mind what that looked like. And I started thinking, well, are any of the things he's listing not applicable to the trucking industry? And 2 that jumped out at me, it was 2 incidents of the same type violation. It dealt with trench boxes. And if people don't know what a trench box is, that's when they're digging a pipeline or digging some sort of excavation in the ground, and they put a metal box down in the ground to keep the walls from collapsing on workers that may be in that trench. But even then, we've got trucking companies that haul pipe for pipelines out in very remote areas. West Texas, we see it all the time. And oftentimes those truck drivers, they're out there and all they're doing is delivering pipe. But every one of us on this call know that on a real live construction job, even if it's wrong, even if it's illegal, sometimes they need an extra hand, or that truck driver just decides he's going to help. And we could end up with a truck driver actually in a trench. So my point is, of every one of those things you named, there's not a one of them on that list that couldn't occur to one of our trucking companies or a trucking company somewhere in the U.S. So I want to, your introduction there was powerful. Man, it was powerful. So very, very, very powerful. And the second thing I want to just remind our listeners of very quickly is the 4 of us, our roles. Myself, Mike, and Barry, we are truck guys that periodically have a toe over in the OSHA world. Jim is our OSHA guru that periodically has a toe over in the trucking world. But the fact that we're doing this podcast on driving the line and we're dealing with OSHA, if our listeners don't get anything else out of this episode, and this is something that Mike Bohan and I preach constantly, and Barry Harrison will begin preaching constantly, trucking companies need to realize you are regulated by OSHA. There are so many trucking companies that think they're exclusively under the purview of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration or PHMSA if they haul hazmat, and nothing could be further from the truth. You are so regulated by OSHA. And if you ever have a serious bodily injury or fatality at your facility, you will learn very quickly how much you are regulated by OSHA. So this topic is critically important to our trucking clients. It's critically important to the trucking industry. And Jim, what a powerful way of laying down the foundation for the rest of this conversation. Kudos to you, my friend. That was one of the most powerful introductions I've ever heard. Just absolutely amazing. And thank you for laying that predicate for the rest of this conversation.
Yeah, Jim, when you going back to your original question there of why we're missing this in this industry, and I think one of the reasons for me, with the trucking companies that I work with when we're out there visiting with folks is they've never had this conversation. They've never had any. I mean, it's like you start a trucking company, you're wading through all the regulations on the DOT side, and you're trying to figure that stuff out, and nobody ever really has this conversation with them. And I think that's why it's important that we have this conversation today, because I'm hoping that it's reaffirming some things that some of the companies that are listeners of ours know, but maybe it's opening some eyes to some folks that are listening to us that have never had this conversation. Nobody's ever said, "Hey," like Kenny said, "you are regulated by OSHA." And unfortunately for me, in the past, when people find out that they are regulated by OSHA, or they really find out how much they are regulated, it's because somebody's lost their life. There's been a fatality somewhere. Thinking back over the years, most of the OSHA encounters that I've had with trucking companies are due to a fatality. It's a driver got out of a truck and forgot to set their brakes and got behind the truck and it rolled over them. I've seen that happen a couple of times. Um, there's been some issues with confined spaces and tanks where a driver lost their life because there weren't the right protocols set up to have that confined space entry. So that's not the way we want anybody to learn, is to have to go through something like that. And unfortunately, that happens so often. So I think the communication and the education that you're doing now and this podcast is doing now is a great first step to letting people know there's things that are in place for a reason, and it really is. The bottom line is we don't want anybody to lose their life. As you're going down through all of those things, I was kind of doing what Kenny was doing. I'm thinking, okay, have I seen this? Does this apply to a trucking company? The fall through the ceiling, that kind of stuff. I don't know that I've seen that, but I've seen somebody fall off a grain bin and die, and it was a driver. And at the end of the day, the trucking company said, we don't know why he was up there. We don't know what he was doing, but he ended up falling off there and ended up dying. And so there's things like that come up in the trucking world. And that's when OSHA comes in and at that point wants to get real familiar with the operation. So yeah, we're right in the middle of it. And there's just so many folks out there that don't realize that.
Jim, and I agree with 100% everything Mike just said. Absolutely. And Jim, we always, with the deepest and most profound respect, give you credit for being our OSHA go-to guy. I mean, you just simply are. And we're so grateful that you're there to help us with OSHA stuff. But, Mike and Barry and I, we periodically, not to the degree you do, simply because we don't have your expertise, but we periodically walk through the shops of our clients, of trucking companies, and the safety director say, "Hey, let's go walk through the shop and point some things out to me." And that's kind of a non-threatening environment because they haven't had an incident yet. OSHA hasn't been in, but there's at least some awareness that there's the potential for that. And so, the things I see, and at some point I want all of us to discuss what are the four of us actually seeing out there in the real trucking world. And and you asked us right off the bat what the number one cited, and I just took a guess that it was HAZCOM. And the reason I guess that is that's the number one thing I find when I go and do an OSHA walkthrough on a trucking company. And just so people know, if they're not familiar, HAZCOM really does not deal with transportation of hazardous materials, but it's hazardous materials or hazardous products that are available in a shop. Everything from a rattle can of spray paint to brake cleaner I've seen more and more truck companies now are getting 330-gallon totes and putting them in the shop and filling them up with DEF or, filling them up with whatever product they need. But everything from batteries, battery acid, they may even have a lawnmower that they use there at the shop to mow the yard around the terminal, and they got a 5-gallon gas can sitting there or whatever. I mean, there's all these products that are in these shops that are regulated. And what has come is, and I'll make it very, very simple. And Jim, you can flesh this out to whatever degree you want to, but basically the employer, the motor carrier, has an obligation to have a safety data sheet available that tells those employees dealing with those products what the dangers are. That is the hazard communication, HAZCOM, what the dangers of those products are. Those employees have to be trained on those safety data sheets, and they have to have unfettered access to them anytime they're working. And so oftentimes I'll ask, I'll just randomly pick up a spray can of something, brake cleaner, and say, show me the SDS on this. And you can tell when they got that deer in the headlight look, number one, there's no SDS. Number two, they don't even have a clue what you're talking about. And certainly there's been no training on any of it. So HAZCOM's the biggest thing I see. From the motor care perspective itself, I find very few trucking companies that have an emergency action plan. And y'all know if they got 10 or more employees on site, it has to be in writing, and they have to do training on it. And it must, at the basic, it's got to include what they do in case of a fire at the facility, what they need to do in case of severe weather. And for all of us on this call, that's tornadoes. I'm in Texas. We also deal with hurricanes along our Gulf Coast. And in certain parts of the country, what do they do in case of an earthquake or a wildfire? Could be a severe weather event. And then, unfortunately, it's the reality of our world today. They've got to have training that they do for their employees on workplace violence. If they have an active shooter come onto that facility, what are the employees supposed to do? And then the third thing, when we're just doing the walkthrough of the shop, and we always harp on forklifts. Most trucking companies, if their shop's big enough, they've got a forklift on site. And Jim, you've developed an outstanding forklift training program. It's just world class in every way. But the point is, they need to be doing forklift training. Every truck shop on this planet's got jacks in it. And those jacks have got to have the load weight rating on them. Ladders. I see ladders all the time that either have broke rungs, they don't have the proper feet on them, they don't have the weight rating on them. And then you mentioned lockout and tagout earlier, and we've mentioned before, we've got two ladies behind the scene on this podcast, Miss Amanda and Miss Erin, that are really the brains of our operation. We're just four old country boys that talk, but they're the ones that put this whole thing together. And ladies, I'm making a point right here in the middle of this podcast. Whenever y'all publish this episode, would y'all make the link back to Jim's program that he developed on lockout tagout for trucks? I want to put a plug in for this just a moment, ladies and gentlemen. We normally think of lockout tagout as immobilizing some sort of energy source, whether that's electrical, pneumatic, hydraulic, whatever it may be. And we think about things like locking out say a breaker panel, or locking out a flywheel on something that could entangle a mechanic's hands or something like that. But Jim Seibert developed this awesome program, and I've seen him teach it in person and I've seen him teach it online, and it is just world class in every way of thinking of an 18-wheeler, a 5-axle truck tractor semi-trailer as that being the energy source, and it's sitting in a shop. How do we lock out, tag out that entire truck? And I'm just asking, I want the ladies to put a link whenever we send this episode out of how people can go back and look at that previous program Jim had on lockout, tag out on truck. And then the last one I'll mention, I'll shut up and let these other guys talk. One thing we never think about, there's an exception in the OSHA regs on injury and illness reporting that basically carves out motor vehicle accidents. If somebody's injured or killed in a motor vehicle accident, that normally does not fall under OSHA's injury and illness reporting, with one huge exception. If it happens inside a construction zone, it's 100% reportable to OSHA. So if any of our clients or any trucking companies listen, unfortunately, if you have an accident that occurs inside a work zone or construction zone, whatever your state happens to call that, and it involves your truck and somebody seriously injured, hospitalization, or heaven forbid, there's a fatality, you fall completely under OSHA's reporting, the standard for injury and illness reporting. And there's some very tight deadlines that's measured in hours on how quick you have to notify OSHA. So, Jim, those are the main things I see from our trucking clients, and clearly I'll let Mike and Barry jump in and share anything else that they've seen as well.
Let me jump in here real quick before you guys take off a little bit further. A couple things Kenny brought up there, and I love it when Kenny gets fired up, because he's hit so many of my bullet points for this, and you're just an eloquent speaker, my friend. And so you do an excellent job of taking care of most of my notes here. You talked about EAP, right? And that 10 employee rule, and whether it can be communicated, just verbally, or if you've got to have a full blown out training event based upon the number of employees you have. There's another national emphasis program that is in the works right now. So national emphasis program, it's an NEP. It is nationwide. It's currently in the notice of proposed rulemaking stage, the NPRM, and it's the HIP. Any of you guys heard of HIP yet? Heat Injury Illness Prevention Plan. Right. That is another one that has a number of employees stipulation to it. And so it's something to pay attention to. Right. I've been into many maintenance shops since beginning this journey, and not a single one of them has had a completely controlled environment where all of the maintenance employees are inside and the air condition is pumping, or the heat's been pumping. Not seen it. So this HIP program, Heat Injury Illness Prevention Program, that's a whole new dynamic that's going to hit the workforce, that's got some stipulations about 80 and 90 degrees with different flags of different things that you've got to have in place on site. It's going to take, a management of change, and it's really going to take concerted effort when this program, which it's looking pretty strong, it's going to come true when this rolls out. So different planning based on how many employees that you have on site. And if you've got 4 people working in your shop, but you have 8 people on the inside of your building, sedentary, sitting in seats, it still qualifies, because you've got more than 10 employees on site. So your program is going to have to be pretty beefy. So, gentlemen, back to the question, why are we still in this state when we've got so much material? We have so many things that are out there and available. We've got consultants such as ourselves. And Barry, let me get pretty pointed and direct. You're coming from the industry where you were a director of safety. Being honest in a gut check, what kept you up at night? Did you feel like you had your safety program under control, that your shop was up to par?
Jim, that's a great question, and that's one of the many things that keeps a director of safety up at night. It's always that balance between operation and safety, right? We all know that if the truck's not rolling, we're not making money. And it always reminds me of when trucks were in the shop. It's like you're going back there, you're checking on the truck. What's the status? And unfortunately, sometimes those processes and procedures become a little bit of an afterthought. I'll be honest and transparent with everyone. You're trying to get that truck back on the road, right? And it really reminds me of an instance, and it made us put more of a lockout, tag out process into place, we had a standard truck that was sitting right in front of an overhead door, and we're trying to get it out, and we're doing the last checks on it. And so, one of the things you have to do before your truck goes is you let it run for a certain amount of time after you do the prepare or repair, so that obviously the truck's going to remain running. Well, we had a guy jump in, just start the truck, didn't check to see if it was in neutral or not. Now that's a simple thing, right? That seasoned veteran drivers usually don't encounter. But we were kind of under the gun. We had to go pick up a load, and fortunately, no one was standing in front of the shop. But we did lose an overhead door to that, and so it made us step back, have the stand down that we needed to have, and discuss, okay, what are some of the things we need to be checking before we start a truck? And we went back to the basics, that, those things that are sometimes you tend to overthink them because it's a simple thing that you don't think you need to explain to people. But when it is time critical, we tend to forget. So that's one of the instances that comes to mind, and there are several that come to mind when I was actually driving. That I'm climbing up on the trailer when I'm having to pump gas or diesel out of a confined space, and I'm climbing up on the truck to check how full is my tank, and then I'm climbing down and I'm looking down into the tank, and I think about all those times that I had to do that. And it's just very important, especially if you're a driver and you're out there having to do these things by yourself. Make sure that you're making a call to your dispatcher before you're climbing up and down and having to look down into that tank. And because you're breathing in some of those vapors when that pump is taking place. So I can't encourage enough. Make sure someone knows that you're doing these necessary yet dangerous activities. Like I said, just make a call to your dispatcher, make a call to someone that says, hey, I'm going to be doing these things. I just want to make sure somebody knows. If you don't hear from me in an hour or so, maybe call the facility and check on me. But there's numerous things, again, that come to mind that, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. And so I can't encourage people enough, when you're doing any of these things that you think are routine, I can't encourage you enough. Just slow down, think about what that safest process is, and make sure that you're doing that.
Mike, you brought up falling off a grain bin fatality, and Barry, you just brought up, hey, I'm out on site. It just made me think of something. Your safety culture that you build in your company, it doesn't get checked at the door when that truck driver leaves, right? In that lockout, tagout considerations in the trucking industry, that presentation program that, we built, it's about taking it with you and having that consideration, because our truck drivers are not always sitting in our maintenance shops. They're not always in our yard. But if we can train them up to identify hazards, and we develop that safety culture within them, when they go to somebody else's, when they're on somebody else's site, they can at least say, I'm not going to put myself in a bad situation here. Climbing on top of a grain bin, that's outside my job purview. Why would I do this? Just things of that nature. The safety culture is imperative. And I guess to answer my own question that I asked at the very beginning, and wrapping up here, we have no excuse. And it's a gut check for me, as I've changed roles and my career has adapted and pushed me into a regulatory and consultation aspect, where I've graduated from the laborer, the guy with the corn scoop cleaning up at the local cooperative, and to where I am today. My mind has changed. I no longer can say I'm okay. Hey, everything's fine. I need to be responsible for me and those that are around me and the things that I encounter. And if if my maintenance facility, that piece of my trucking company, if we're falling short, we have got to reach out. We've got to find a trusted consultant. The search engines are out there, and it doesn't take long to jump online, whatever search engine you're looking at. AI is involved in everything. All you have to do is type out the question you want the answer to. There are so many resources at our fingertips, but there is no greater resource. Let's toot our own horn here. There's no greater resource than to calling a consultant that this has been their bailiwick, their bread and butter, and this has been the special emphasis, the focus that they have had for several years. So reach out. We're here for you. We want to bring your company up to the safest possible level that we can, that's within our power. At the end of the day, all we can do is provide you the material. All we can do is come in and help train. All we can do is bring a positive energy around safety and show that safety drives operations. Safety is one of the best financial investments that you will ever make, because an injury or a fatality is going to cost so much more. And it's not just the monetary effect of it. My conscience is heavy, and I have shared my why on here. But when I know that the injury that happened underneath my watch has a secondary and tertiary effect down a family line, I take it personal and I challenge myself daily. That's my why.
Amen.
With that, I'm going to close. Thank you, Mike, Barry, Kenny, for all of the input for this discussion. Thank you, listeners, for joining us today. And ladies behind the scenes, thanks for making me sound good today. We will catch you all next time on Driving the Line, the Pursuit of Safety.
That's all the time we have for this episode of Driving the Line, the Pursuit of Safety. We hope you enjoyed our discussion, and thank you for listening. You can rate, review, and subscribe to Driving the Line, the Pursuit of Safety on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other app you're using. You can also follow Marsh McLennan Agency on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Until next time, thanks again for listening. Drive safely, everyone.